Hi, what's up? My name is Matthew Baumeister. Today we're going to be going over in depth the different synovial joints of the human body. So the first set of joints we're going over are the wrist joints, or the radial carpal joints. This is an ellipsoidal type of joint, and there's two sets of movements that go with it. There's a wrist flexion, wrist extension, which is along the XZ plane or the transverse plane. And the second set of movements is the ulnar deviation and the radial deviation. And that's along the frontal or XY plane. And this causes it to have 2 degrees of freedom. The joint that we're going over is the shoulder joint or the glenohumeral joint. This has 3 degrees of freedom because it has 3 different types of movement. And it's a ball and socket type of joint, and that's what causes it to have 3 degrees of freedom. First type of movement is shoulder flexion and shoulder extension along the YZ or the sagittal plane. The next set of movements is shoulder abduction and shoulder adduction along the XY or frontal plane. The final set of movements for the shoulder is shoulder lateral rotation and shoulder medial rotation, which is along the XZ or the transverse plane. The next joints we're going over are the elbow joints or the humeral ulnar joints, which is a hinge joint. And there's only 2 sets of movements, or 1 set of movement that's involved with it, giving it 1 degree of freedom. There's elbow extension and elbow flexion, which this is along the sagittal or YZ plane. Forearm joint is a 1 degree of freedom type of joint, and it's a pivot joint, also known as a radial ulnar joint. And the 2 types of movement are forearm supination and forearm pronation, and this is along the XZ plane or the transverse plane. The next joint is the acetabular femoral joint or the hip joint, and this is a ball and socket joint with 3 degrees of freedom. First type of motion is along the frontal or XY plane, and this is hip abduction or hip adduction. The second type of movement is along the YZ or sagittal plane, and this involves hip flexion and hip extension. This type of hip movement is along the XZ axis or the transverse axis, and this involves the hip medial rotation or the hip lateral rotation. Second to last joint is the knee joint, which is a hinge joint with 1 degree of freedom, otherwise known as the tibiofemoral joint. This joint is along the YZ plane or the sagittal plane, and this involves knee flexion and knee extension. The last joint we're going over is a metacarpal phalangeal joint or the ankle joint, which has 2 degrees of freedom. This type of joint is a condyloid joint. Movements are along the YZ plane or sagittal plane, and this involves ankle plantar flexion and ankle dorsiflexion. The second set of movements on the ankle are on the XZ plane, which is the transverse plane, and this involves ankle adduction and ankle abduction. And the last set of movements are on the XY plane or the frontal plane. That includes ankle inversion and ankle eversion. That concludes our set of major synovial joints. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope it was very informative.